At a tender age of 3, he narrowly escaped death when the sack he was sleeping on caught fire. At 27, he again narrowly escaped death when the hotel room he was staying in caught fire during the Geneva Conference. However, his hide-and-seek game with fire tragically ended on the 15th of August 2011 when he perished in a mysterious fire at his farmhouse in Beatrice. Perhaps the general had cheated death too many times, he had run out of tricks. Or maybe this was death's way of reminding him that he was, after all, human, not a cat with 9 lives. Many wondered how such a decorated military commander could have died in such an ordinary way. This was a man who had survived various encounters with fire unharmed, a military leader who never used his military rank to avoid fighting at the battlefront like what many of his peers did. As we examine the Nari Rebellion within the context of the Rex Nongo story, a critical question arises. If Nari and his group had succeeded in their rebellion, what would have happened to Tongogara? Would he be celebrated today? And what about Nongo himself? He was part of Tongogara's high command which Nari was trying to get rid of. Would we be celebrating Nongo today? What would have become of him? Would Tafi be producing a series about him today? Well, fellow Sazaitas, Slay Queens and Bingas, Socialites, Papalites, Vasnamalites, Varkujgarais, Never Snamarites. Welcome to the special report. This is part 3 of the Rex Nongo series. In parts 1 and 2, we discussed Mjuru's birth in 1945, his early political activism in the 60s, his military training under ZAPU from 1967 to 1969, his defection from ZAPU to ZANU in 1971, and how he met his wife, Joyce, in 1974. We also talked about his rise in Zanla and his role as commander of the combined Zipra and Zanla forces under Zipa. But today, we're going to focus on the Nari Rebellion and its circumstances in the context of the Rex Nongo story. We are exploring the life, the politics, and the death of Solomon Mjuru. Now, one of the key sources for this series has been a book by Dr. Miles Tendi titled The Army and Politics in Zimbabwe. It's available on Amazon. To understand the Nari Rebellion in the context of the Rex Nongo story, we must begin the story in 1973, when ZANU was still based in Zambia. You see, the year 1973 marked a critical turning point for ZANU. Events that year set the stage for numerous challenges that would affect ZANU in the years to come. In particular, the outcome of an elective conference that was held in Kafue triggered a series of events that culminated in ZANU's first major encounter with dissidents, a period known in history as the Nari Rebellion. Notably, the operation to suppress the Nari Rebellion was codenamed Operation Gukuraundi. So you see, Gukuraundi inakutanga kuma 80s wangu. Vana Nari were the first casualties of Gukuraundi. But we can't start talking about the Nari Rebellion without fully understanding the High Command and the Darere Chimurenga. Because keep in mind, the Nari Rebellion was a coup d'etat on Tongogara's High Command. And it was the Darere Chimurenga which tried Thomas Nari and his group. Tirikuti Nari Rebellion yakanga iri coup against the High Command ya Tongogara. And at the end of it all, Thomas Nari nevese vaimtsigira vakatongwa ne Darere Chimurenga. So now we need to understand what the Darere Chimurenga was and what the High Command was and the difference. The High Command was a subcommittee of the Darere Chimurenga. And the Darere Chimurenga was ZANU's war council, chaired by Herbert Chitepo. Remember, ZANU was formed in 1963 by radical members of ZAPU who disagreed with Joshua Nkomo on strategy. They wanted a more radical approach in the quest to liberate Zimbabwe. Vaiti Nkomo is soft as wool, steady in diplomacy, trikuda action. They wanted a policy of direct confrontation. So this radical faction of ZAPU broke away from ZAPU and formed ZANU in 1963. The following year, in May 1964, these guys held their first Congress and elected Ndabaningi Stole as their president, with Leopold Takawira as vice president, Robert Mugabe as secretary general, and Herbert Chitepo as chairman. And in line with their radical strategy, a Department of War, disguised as Public Affairs, was established. This Department of War was under the leadership of this guy, Noel Mukono, the first leader of the ZANU army. This was in 1964. The following year, most senior ZANU leaders were arrested. This was a significant blow to ZANU's war objectives. Herbert Chitepo was based in Tanzania at this time, where he worked as a public prosecutor, so he wasn't arrested. Noel Mukono managed to escape Rhodesia, so he wasn't arrested either. So these two, Chitepo and Mukono, were amongst the few ZANU officials who remained free. The rest were arrested. They would spend the next 10 years in prison. So the leaders in prison, determined to advance the armed struggle despite their imprisonment, they instructed Chitepo to lead ZANU in exile and prepare for war. So Chitepo, as the political leader, and Mukono, as the military leader, laid the groundwork for ZANU's war. The principle was that politics would always lead the gun, with Chitepo as chairman of the Daire Chimurenga firmly in charge and the military subservient to the political leadership. However, this dynamic shifted in 1973. You see, in September 1973, ZANU held an elective conference in Zambia where positions in the Daire Chimurenga were contested. The Daire Chimurenga, as I said before, was ZANU's war council, responsible for driving the war effort. It had the following roles: the role of chairman, a secretary for defense, a secretary for finance, secretary for administration, a secretary for external affairs, secretary for information and publicity, a secretary for labor and social welfare, and a secretary for the commissariat. So people were contesting for these positions at the 1973 ZANU Review Conference held at Kafue in Zambia. The hotly contested position at this conference was that of our Secretary for Defense, which at the time was held by Mukono. In fact, he had held this position since the 1964 Congress. Being Secretary for Defense made you leader of ZANLA. So that means that position was both a political position and a military position. The Secretary for Defense was the leader of the High Command. To understand this in practical sense, the Daire Chimurenga was like the modern day Politburo, and the High Command was like the modern day ZDF. The only difference being, ZANLA didn't have an air force. So essentially, the High Command was responsible for the planning and execution of all military operations in accordance with the general strategy laid down by the Daire Chimurenga. In the end, Chitepo was re-elected as chairman of the Daire Chimurenga unopposed. Josiah Tongogara won the position of Secretary for Defense amid allegations of rigging. Rex Nongo was promoted from field commander to provincial commander. Nongo was also elected into the High Command for the first time since he joined ZANU in 1971. But the biggest change was Tongogara's election into the Daire Chimurenga as Secretary for Defense, effectively making him the overall leader of ZANLA. So for the first time since the war began, the ZANU army was now being led by a soldier. Remember, the first leader of ZANLA, Noel Mukono, was not a military man. He never received any military training. The growing influence of the military began to challenge the principle that politics should lead the gun. And gradually, the military started dictating the pace, setting the stage for internal power struggles. So from 1973, Tongogara became ZANU's Secretary for Defense and leader of the High Command, which effectively made him the overall leader of ZANLA, having replaced Noah Mukono. So as the war escalated, ZANLA grew from a force of about 80 trained guerrillas in 1971 to about 800 in 1974. This fast growth of ZANLA created more demands on its organization, communication, and medical facilities. This put pressure on the political leaders, who often struggled to manage the increasing number of recruits. You see, the job of politicians was to formulate a war strategy and source funds while providing food and clothes, and most importantly, weapons. Soldiers, on the other hand, did one job, that is, to fight. But you can't fight when you're hungry or when you don't have the appropriate clothing or, most importantly, the right weapons. These factors often became the bone of contention between the military leadership and the ordinary soldiers. It is worth noting that the leader of the Nari Rebellion, Thomas Nari, used to be a member of ZAPU before joining ZANU. In fact, he deserted ZAPU together with Nongo in 1971. They joined ZANU at the same time, and within a year, they had been promoted to field commanders. Their relationship, however, deteriorated over time due to strategic and personal differences, particularly after the 1972 attacks on Alterna and Whistlefield farms, which provoked a fierce response from the Rhodesian forces. When the war started heating up due to the fierce response of the Rhodesians, Rex Nongo and Thomas Nari, together with other field commanders like Dakaraibaza, started clashing on strategy, to the extent that Dakaraibaza and Thomas Nari ended up leaving the battlefront without authorization from the High Command. Another issue that created a rift between Nongo and Nari was Nari's abduction of school children from St. Albert Mission School to recruit them as ZANLA soldiers. Rex Nongo strongly opposed this action. You see, by 1972, ZANU had shifted towards voluntary recruitment, and Rex Nongo himself had recruited hundreds of guerrillas through voluntary means. The abductions created a diplomatic challenge for ZANU, and the Rhodesian government exploited this incident to fuel its propaganda against the armed struggle. But in my opinion, the issue which presented the Sarajevo incident of the Nari Rebellion was the reorganization of ZANLA's provincial commands. You see, when ZANU was still based in Zambia, its army had 3 provincial commands. These were Zimbabwe-Zambia, ZZ, led by Rex Nongo after 1973, Mozambique-Malawi-Zambia, MMZ, led by Joseph Chimurenga, and Botswana-Bulawayo-Zimbabwe, BBZ, led by Vitalis Zvinavashe. So what happened is that Zvinavashe was moved from BBZ to MMZ, and Chimurenga was moved from MMZ to BBZ. Now, almost immediately, accusations of inefficiency, favoritism, heavy drinking, and womanizing surfaced against Zvinavashe. He was also criticized for promoting his friends to senior roles, some of whom were said to be inexperienced. Things got so bad to the point that by mid-1974, field commanders like Thomas Nari and Dakaraibaza were no longer taking orders from their provincial commander, Zvinavashe, calling him grossly incompetent and out of touch with reality. They were also frustrated with the High Command's mismanagement of things, including supply shortages and poor communication, and also the leadership's failure to visit the front lines. Whatever anger or frustration they had with Tongogara, they took it out on Zvinavashe, to the point of not taking his orders sometimes. Remember, Zvinavashe was the provincial commander. They were under his command. Of course, it didn't help that Zvinavashe himself was doing a lot of things that they were not happy about. So pursuant to this, A military tribunal was set up in June 1974, comprising of Cletus Chigoe, Robson Manyika, Rex Nongo, Zinavashe, and Patrick Mupunzarima. They met in Lusaka to address the rebellious commanders' actions. Some, including Dakaraibaza, were demoted and forcibly returned to the front, while others faced public beatings. Well, of course, this harsh punishment didn't solve anything. If anything, it made things worse, because they simply punished the rebellious commanders but failed to address their grievances. In fact, they didn't even attempt to address the grievances. This was a ticking time bomb, a disaster waiting to happen, a perfect breeding ground for a coup. It was only a matter of time. And in late 1974, a leadership vacuum emerged when senior Zanla commanders, including Rex Nongo, traveled to China on a study tour. Shortly afterwards, Tongogara and Chitepo also traveled to Romania. This was a perfect opportunity for Thomas Nari to finally stage his coup d'etat. With a group of about 30 guerrillas, mostly young recruits who had joined ZANU after 1969, Nari captured Zanla's headquarters in Lusaka and its main military base in Chifombo. They found little resistance in taking over the military base, but those who either resisted or refused to support the rebellion were executed. Nari was not playing. The Nari group reached a point of no return on the 9th of December when they kidnapped 19 ZANU members and supporters, including Tongogara's wife and 3 children. Now at this point, their fate was sealed. The issue became personal to Tongogara because his wife and kids had been kidnapped. He now viewed Nari's actions as unforgivable, punishable only by death. Now, knowing how ruthless Tongogara was, Nari and his fellow comrades must have known that they had crossed the Rubicon, regardless of how genuine their grievances were. The Nari group accused the High Command of corruption and favoritism, like the case of Tongogara allegedly sending whiskey and cigarettes to Josiah Tungamirai, despite alcohol bans at the front. The other grievance was that of neglect and the provision of substandard Chinese weapons. They also criticized the leadership for living luxuriously in Lusaka while the guerrillas sometimes lacked food in Zanla camps. Senior leaders like Tongogara were accused of forcing themselves on female cadres. Allegations of forced abortions were also leveled. These are some of the grievances that led Thomas Nari and Dakaraibaza to lead the Nari rebellion. Their intentions were very clear. They wanted Tongogara's high command to be disbanded and replaced with a completely new one, which would be led by Nari himself, deputized by Dakaraibaza. Afterwards, Thomas Nari sought a meeting with ZANU's political leadership to present his grievances, but the leadership refused to negotiate until the abducted high command members were released. And in response to the rebellion, Tongogara assembled a force of approximately 250 loyal guerrillas for a military operation codenamed Operation Gukurahundi. This is the operation that took back the captured military base and freed the captured high command members. However, Thomas Nari and a few others escaped but were eventually captured with the help of Frelimo. Afterwards, a committee of 3 comprising Herbert Chitepo, Rugare Gumbo and Kumbirai Kangari to investigate the causes of the rebellion and to try the Nari group. Rugare Gumbo described the trial as follows. He said, they traveled to Chifombo to hear accounts regarding the rebellion. John Mataure, the political commissar accused of complicity in the Nari rebellion, presented his case, as did Nari. After listening to these accounts, the group of 3 adjourned to deliberate, intending to reconvene to hear further testimonies before finalizing their judgment. But Tongogara was not interested in any trial or any tribunal, so he killed them, including John Mataure, who was accused of complicity in the rebellion. So So he killed them without informing Chitepo and members of the Dari. Gumbo further noted that Tongogara was a skilled military strategist, but he was overly ambitious, which sometimes led him to take extreme measures to consolidate his power. So feeling threatened by the rebellion, Tongogara responded harshly, Gumbo said. He even added that prior to the rebellion, Tongogara frequently made unilateral decisions without informing the Darere Chimurenga. So just like that, Thomas Nari and his fellow conspirators were killed before most of them had been tried, before judgment had been issued. Now let's focus our attention on the role of Rex Nongo in suppressing the Nari rebellion. As I said before, Thomas Nari exploited the leadership vacuum created when Nongo and other high command members traveled to China for a study tour. Before this trip, Rex Nongo warned Tongogara that a rebellion might happen. Thomas Nari was unhappy because of ongoing problems that Tongogara and the other leaders had ignored for years. Rex Nongo was reluctant to go to China, suspecting that Nari might use the absence of senior leadership to launch a full-scale rebellion. However, Tongogara dismissed this possibility, perhaps believing that no one would dare challenge his authority so openly. What made it worse was that shortly after Nongo and the other senior military leadership left for China, Tongogara and Chitepo departed for Romania. This gave Thomas Nari the perfect opportunity to stage a coup. Rex Nongo later said the following regarding Thomas Nari and his group. He said, "Those guys were involved in a power struggle with Tongogara. If they had killed Tongogara first, history would be different. In a power struggle during wartime, you must win or you are finished." And indeed, they were finished. Had Nari succeeded with his plan and led Zanla to Zimbabwe's independence, he would have been celebrated today as the great commander and hero of the revolution. Most likely, Tongogara would have been forgotten, remembered only as the leader who lost his way and got outmaneuvered by visionary field commanders who took matters into their own hands. History, as they say, is written by the victors. You see, officially, the 2017 coup is not called a coup in Zimbabwe. This is because the victors don't want to call it a coup. They call it a military-assisted transition. History is written by the victors. Noah Mukono is the godfather of Zanla. He established Zanla together with Chitepo, but today is not mentioned in history. Why? Because he had a fallout with the politically correct side of ZANU. History is written by the victors. Until 2023, Ndabaningi Stole, the founding president of ZANU, was not considered a national hero. He was a sellout. History is written by victors. And in 2023, when they finally declared him a national hero, Ndabaningi Stole instantly went from being a Mutengesi to being a national hero. Why? History is written by victors. That ends part 3 of the Rex Nongo series. Our aim to finish the series in part 4. As always, thank you so much for watching. And if you enjoy the content, please like and share.